UnlimitedViz.com. And we have obviously a SharePoint focus, focusing primarily on business intelligence forms and workflow. My blog is there. It's whitepages.unlimitedviz.com. And if you feel so inclined, you can follow me on Twitter. DiverDown1964 is my handle. Good luck getting a handle with the name John White. As well, I have an About Me page if you'd like to learn any more. And as you can see from the slide, I'm a bit of an avid scuba diver. So, in any event, so today it's very much of a how-to, hands-on talk. We're of course using CloudShare, and we're going to be starting with an environment that's already had the major SQL bits installed, as I mentioned. The reason for this is that it just takes too long to perform the SQL installation steps, and in fact, you have to run through the installation steps several times. However, because that's an important step, I'm going to walk through some screenshots of the installs themselves so that you can see how the environment got to where it's at. After that, we're going to perform everything live, and you can follow along if you wish to do so. We're then going to cover off the configuration of both PowerPivot for SharePoint and Reporting Services in SharePoint integrated mode. Now, both of these installations and configurations are using the BI assets from SQL Server 2012, and especially in the case of Reporting Services, these steps are significantly different than working with previous versions of SQL Server. So if you have any questions about these differences or what you would do with something like SQL Server 2008 R2, pop them into the window. I'll answer questions on the differences as they arise. We're then going to cover off some of the steps and considerations involved in deploying these assets to production site collections, touch on some troubleshooting steps, and if time permits, talk about some of the big changes in this space with SharePoint 2013. So the environment we're working with is a small SharePoint farm consisting of a single SharePoint server that provides both front-end and application roles. I'm just going to pop over into the actual CloudShare environment here. You should be able to see that pop up right here. So this is the environment that you're either looking at now or will be looking at when it spins up. So we've the second machine down is our SharePoint front-end server. There's obviously an Active Directory server to provide domain services. And we have a Windows 7 client for client-side operations down here at the bottom. We're primarily going to be concerned with the Windows 7 client and the SharePoint front-end server. I didn't mention it, but we of course have a SQL server to support all of this stuff. But it's only providing database services, and that's an important distinction to as we move through. We will also have plenty of time for questions as we move through this this demonstration. There are a few steps where it takes a few minutes for things to load up. So what I'll do is I'll let the questions queue up, and when we get a moment, we can knock through them. All right. So back over here to the presentation. So to start with, our environment was initially created this way. You can see we have the SharePoint front-end server, and we've got the SQL Server role. The SharePoint server provides both front-end and application roles. This is very typical of many small SharePoint farms. Unfortunately, there's some confusion that arises when it's time to add Reporting Services integrated mode and/or PowerPivot into the farm. The confusion stems from the fact that both products are developed by, or sorry, both of these products are developed by the SQL Server team at Microsoft, not the Office Server team, and they're available only on the SQL Server media. So the logical conclusion that many people jump to is that they should therefore be installed on the SQL Server. The problem with this is that for either product to function, they must be installed on the server with the SharePoint bits that's already been joined to the SharePoint farm itself. So what winds up happening in far too many cases is that we install SharePoint on our SQL Server. Now this adds a level of unnecessary complication, and it can adversely affect our SQL performance. SQL performance is the most important factor in SharePoint performance, so anything that adversely affects it affects the overall experience. So what do? Well, the reality is that instead of installing the SharePoint bits on the SQL Server, we should install the relevant SQL bits on the SharePoint server. And that results in this sort of an architecture. So here we can see that both reporting services and PowerPivot for SharePoint sit alongside of other SharePoint services on an application server. As of SQL 2012, both of these services are actually SharePoint shared services, so this just makes sense. Now again, this is a small SharePoint farm, and in a scaled out version, these services would need to be installed on any application servers on which you want to run them, but not the front end servers themselves, and we'll get into more on that shortly. All right, so we're going to walk through the SQL media installation for PowerPivot first. So imagine, if you will, we've taken our disk, we've mounted our ISO file on our SQL server, and we're ready to run through the steps. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the setup's going to need to be run twice, and you're going to see why here in just a second. They're very much distinct from one another. When you install PowerPivot for SharePoint, what you're actually installing is a special instance of analysis services that will be used by the server to interact with the data model. As such, it installs as an analysis services instance. So again, I'm not walking through all of the installation slides here, but just the ones that bear any comment or discussion. So to start with, everybody who's installed SQL has seen this screen. In both cases, PowerPivot and Reporting Services, we start with a new standalone installation or add features to an existing installation. So once we get to the Setup Role screen, in this case, we need to select the SQL Server PowerPivot for SharePoint option, which is different than installing any other SQL features. The only reason you'll ever pick this option is if you're installing PowerPivot for SharePoint. You'll also only see this option appear if you're using either the Business Intelligence or the Enterprise license for SQL. It is not available with the standard edition of SQL Server. Next up, we get to the feature selection, and apart from the instance location, which should probably be something other than the system drive. In this case, in this environment, we only have the system drive, so we're going ahead and doing that. But there are no real options. These are the things that are going to be installed, and you can notice on this screen, it's not referred to anymore as PowerPivot for SharePoint, but Analysis Services SharePoint Integration. That gets to be important with 2013, but I'm definitely getting ahead of myself if I get there. Now, in the instance configuration, although it can be customized, I would strongly recommend maintaining the name PowerPivot for the instance name. This product's hard enough to maintain without adding another level of non-default complexity, so if we leave it at PowerPivot, there's an awful lot of things that we will not have to configure. You will also notice that above it's grayed out where you can pick the default instance or a named instance. It can't be installed into a default instance, so should you wish to connect directly to it cannot be installed to anything but a named instance. The nice part is, because this is in fact analysis services, if you want to test it out or just see how this works, you can connect to that instance through Management Studio with SQL, or you could use Excel to connect directly through using an analysis services data provider to the server name /PowerPivot. Okay, so the service accounts need to be configured, and one thing you should notice that you cannot, like most SQL instances, you cannot use any kind of a local account here. It must be a domain account. That should raise a few flags. One of the big flags it should tell you is that it must be in a domain, obviously, and it can't be used in a standalone SharePoint installation. And in fact, PowerPivot is not supported in that sort of an installation. Now, what account to use? Well, the easiest account to use here is the farm account. I wouldn't do this in production, particularly if you're using managed account features like changing password, because it will not be managed here. So if you have SharePoint going ahead and changing your farm password, you're going to need to manually update it here, and you're not going to know what it is. So definitely don't do this. There are more configuration steps required if you don't use the farm account. So we're going ahead and doing that today, but just be aware. I would typically use some sort of a services account that's not going to be used elsewhere in your SharePoint farm as a managed account. Okay, so finally we get to select the accounts that can be used to administer the PowerPivot instance. Now, you're going to want to include any of the service accounts used by Excel services and PowerPivot Shared Services application pools. You also want to add, of course, any administrators that you want to get in there and change. Who can be the administrator? There's a few important distinctions there, and I didn't actually mention it, but also for reporting services. If you're going to use the BISM connection type with reporting services to generate PowerView models, that service needs to be an administrator for this analysis services or PowerPivot instance. Okay. Now, that's basically it. When we hit next, the SQL Server bits are going to be laid down. And the next thing we want to do is configure PowerPivot for SharePoint. So this is a new tool that's available in SQL Server 2012. And I'm just going to pop over onto the SharePoint front-end machine so you can see how we start it. We're not actually going to run through it again because it takes a little bit too long. I don't want to make everybody wait for it. So if we look, we hit this is our SharePoint front-end server that we're on here, and you can see this PowerPivot configuration tool is available. Now this is the most recently used menu. It normally lives under All Programs, SQL Server 2012 Configuration Tools, and it's here. So you're going to use this tool whenever you want to configure PowerPivot, whenever you want to upgrade it if you had PowerPivot installed from SQL Server 2008 R2, or if you want to remove PowerPivot from your SharePoint farm, you're going to want to use this tool. And what it essentially is, I'll come back here and bring that up. What it essentially is a set of PowerShell scripts that can be run. So if you've ever had the pleasure of setting up PowerPivot 2008 R2, all of these steps had to be done manually. So what this is basically is it's a tool to make sure that everything is okay to go ahead and do it, and it actually performs an awful lot of the operations. So you'd start with making sure it's configured properly by giving it the installation account and username, whatever your installation count on your SharePoint farm is. Again, this has already been done for us in our environment. We don't have to worry about doing it. I just want you to see it. Once you do that, you can see that on the left-hand side here we've got some blue eyes. And that just basically means something has been configured and needs to be revalidated. So next up we could hit we go to the Create PowerPivot Service Application, and in here we want to set the name of our service application. I don't like the default name. The default name is quite literally default PowerPivot application. So if we're looking for our shared service, we're looking under D instead of P, and that doesn't make sense to me. So I like to change the name of that application. And any other things you wanted to customize, you'd go in here and do. And once you're ready, and yeah, another important step here is to activate the PowerPivot features in the site collection. That could be done if you miss this step, but this is going to go out there and turn on the PowerPivot features for you. And then finally, we're setting up what the unattended account is if it hasn't already been created in your farm. And when we're ready, we're going to hit this validate button down here. Everything will go basically with the green flags, and it'll go ahead and lay down those bits. And that's it from a SQL, on the server necessarily installation for PowerPivot. So, same thing with reporting services. It's a little bit easier. We start out with the new option. Now, we won't be adding services to the PowerPivot instance that we've already created. In fact, we won't be using SQL instances per se for SSRS the way we did with 2008 R2. As I mentioned before, 2012 Reporting Services is a fully fledged SharePoint shared service now, so we select New Installation. We're obviously not doing PowerPivot, so we select SQL Server Feature Installation. Now on the feature selection page, you'll notice that nothing is selected in the instance features section. In addition to the two reporting services features right here, reporting services SharePoint and the add-in, which we're going to come back to here in just a second, I have a few other items selected. These items aren't strictly necessary, and they may not even be permitted in your environment, but I normally include the SQL Server data tools, which, if you don't already know, is the new name for the product formerly known as BIDS, Business Intelligence Development Studio, which in effect is Visual Studio with business intelligence templates added. If there's any chance that I'll ever need to do any BI work on the server itself, I find it to be a real convenience. I like to include SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services, as well, as I frequently use SSIS to move data in or out of SharePoint, which is a whole topic for another day. And then finally, the management tools, which is SQL Server Management Studio. I consider these tools almost essential on the SharePoint server, if for no other reason to aid in connectivity issues. Now, the two reporting services features, coming back to them, they bear a fair bit of explanation. The first option, Reporting Services - SharePoint, is the actual SharePoint shared service, which is the replacement for the old SSRS instance that would have been loaded up in a SQL Server instance. In this environment, where the SharePoint server performs both application and front-end roles, both of these features must be installed. But if you have a multi-server farm, this feature should be installed on any application server that's going to be responsible for processing reports. Okay. Now, the add-in feature performs exactly the same role as the one that comes with the prerequisite installer in SharePoint 2010. This one has simply been updated to work with SQL Server Reporting Services 2012. It needs to be installed on any server responsible for rendering reports, which is in effect all front-end servers. And I actually recommend putting it on any application servers too, just for testing. This step itself is often overlooked due to the fact that if someone's already rolled out reporting services integrated mode and they're doing an upgrade, they never had to do it before because the prerequisite installer takes care of it for them. So unfortunately, that version does not work with Reporting Services 2012. It needs to be done. Okay, so the rest of install is fairly straightforward. We don't really have a whole lot of options to choose from here. And once these steps are complete, we're ready to configure our environment. And this is where the permalink environment that you should have currently is. So we're ready to get our hands dirty and jump into the environment. I'll pause right now to answer any questions that may have come up. Have we got any questions yet? I'm hearing crickets, so I'm guessing.
Hi, John. No questions yet. You're doing an outstanding job explaining.
Oh, thanks very much. All right, I'm just going to bring up a couple of notes here. Okay. Oh, shoot, 1 second here. Bear with me, folks.
John, we do have a question right now. Joseph does not have the permalink.
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, Joseph does not have
the permalink itself.
Right. It should be in the chat window.
It is. It's go.cloudshare.com/JPW. I'll repaste it in the chat window.
Great.
Okay.
And we also have a question of asking if a presentation of the session will be available later.
I believe that's correct. I believe Ezzy mentioned that earlier.
Great. We'll make sure we email that to you, Todd. And then we also have a question from Nick. Says, if we have two web front ends for a SharePoint 2010 website, will we have to install SSRS on both? Or could we bring up another server specifically for SSRS / SharePoint 2010?
It's a great question, and it all depends on what you want to do and what your requirements are. So to answer it, you could install it on both of them. You could install it on all three of them. It depends on your processing requirements. One of the nice things about reporting services now being a proper SharePoint shared service is that it can be load balanced like any other SharePoint shared service. So if both of your servers are currently providing both application and front-end roles, you could put it on both of them. I would have to see your usage patterns to properly answer the question. If you have the option of adding another server, I would say do so, because it's never going to hurt. And you could allocate just reporting services to one of them. You could allocate reporting services and other SharePoint services as you wish. It's very easy to scale out any of these SharePoint services. And now reporting services works exactly the same way. Just the important thing to note is when you're doing that install, that the first feature there that was not the add-in is the one you want to install, and anything that's going to be, again, building the reports, and then the add-in needs to be installed on any of the front-end servers that the users are going to hit.
Oh.
Okay. So we've got everything installed, and you're going to see, so if you recognize this screen, we're in Central Administration. I'll go through the proper steps. So starting off from Central Administration, we go into Manage Service Applications, and we're going to notice one thing right off. We've got a new service application from before we did the install, which is PowerPivot. But we don't see reporting services yet. And the reason for that is that PowerPivot configuration tool that I just walked through in the slides goes ahead and builds this for us. There is no equivalent with the reporting services tool. We have to add this ourselves. Fortunately, it's really easy, and we're going to do that right now. So if you're following along, please feel free to come along with me. From the ribbon, we pick New, and we pick New SQL Server Reporting Services Service Application. We want to give it a name, SQL Server Reporting Services. You obviously can call it anything you want. Then the question is, do you want to have an isolated application pool for it? Do we want to use an existing application pool? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and create a new one, SSRS. We'll give it the service account that the rest of the services use, which is SP Services. We want to give it the name of the database server, and I think it's SharePoint SQL. We're using an alias in this case. And we want to give it a database name. One thing I want to note here is if you are upgrading from 2008 R2 to 2012, you would put your reporting services database on this server, then use the same name here. Sort of the same way that any of the other SharePoint service applications work. And if you do that, it's going to upgrade your 2008 R2 reporting services database to the new format and work with it. So you won't lose anything. Now I'm scrolling down to the bottom, and basically it says, what web application do we want to associate with? The one we're going to use is Portal Home. If you wanted to enable it on my sites, please feel free to go ahead, but I'm just going to pick Portal Home, and I'm going to click OK. And the new service application is going to be provisioned. And this is just going to take a second. Do we have any more questions in there?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. One just came in from Aslam.
Yeah, there we go.
Let me read this. Can I have credentials of the cloud share environment?
The credentials of the environment itself. I'm honestly not sure what that means. There's one thing, I can quickly, while this is happening, I can flip over here, and if you wanted to go into the machine, apart from the all the service accounts, SPBI, SP Services, they all have the password of uppercase P, the @ symbol, SS word 1, all in lowercase. And then there's some of the previous accounts that are here. If you look under the front-end server, for example, and you pick Show Passwords, you're going to see some of the SP admin, the local administrator of the machines. Those are all located here. Okay. So if I pop back over here, you can see that our shared service application has been successfully created. We can pop into this provision subscriptions and alerts. We're going to do that in just a second. It's just kind of highlighted here because that's something that's new to 2012. So I'm going to click OK, and you can see we now have our SQL Server Reporting Services service application. Okay, so I'm going to click on it. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, I'm not going to go into a super amount of detail. I'm going to describe a few things here. So to start with, the system settings. If you've ever used reporting services in the past, there's a configuration tool that at least used to come for it, and still does if you're working in native mode, that lets you control how reporting services operates. And you'll recognize this screen pretty much. It's exactly the same as that old configuration tool. And it's just some system type settings that, for the most part, you probably won't need to get into. I'll hit cancel. From here, we can manage jobs, which are things like subscriptions, etc. If things are running out of control or whatever, as an administrator, we can shut them down. Key management. There are a number of items that get stored in the reporting services database that are highly secure. So key management allows us because everything's encrypted, we want to back up our key. So if we move the database from one server to another, that we can get at that encrypted data. So it's an important step to do initially. Go ahead and back up your key, and if you've done a backup and restore of the database or a migration, you're going to need to restore that key into there. The execution account is used to be the identity of reporting services when it needs to access things on the file system, etc. It's not used very much. Email settings need to be configured because if you're going to use alerts or if you're going to use any kind of subscriptions with reporting services, it's going to email things out to people, so it's going to need to know what SMTP server, etc. to use. I'm actually going to go in here and configure that so you can see it. This environment is not configured to have email, so it's not going to work. But you actually have to have this configured for a few things to even appear in reporting services. So I'm just going to throw in here SMTP dot AD2008R2.LOC, which is the domain we're using here. If you wanted to go ahead and take this environment and add an SMTP server to it, you can, and just update this at a later date. And the from address is going to be reports at AD2008R2.com, sorry, .LOC. Okay. Yes. And this is just a second here. All right. And then finally, this is new at the bottom, provision subscriptions and alerts. So with 2012, we have the ability for users to create their own subscriptions to reports. So they can say, I would like to be emailed a copy of this report every day, or I would like to be notified when the value of this particular field on a report changes outside of a range, changes at all. Basically, there's a whole lot of criteria for that. So to set that up, you have to come in here and configure basically privileges on the SQL Server because it uses the SQL Server agent process. Now, we've come in here, and one of the first things it looks for is the SQL Server agent service on our SQL box. You can see it's not running. So to deal with that, I'm going to come in here, and I'm on my SharePoint front-end server, but as I mentioned before, I've put on the management tools for SQL, so I can fire them up from here. And I'm going to get my agent to run. Now, in reality, I should probably go over to my SQL Server and set the service to run automatically, because obviously on a reboot, it's not going to come back up. But for our purposes right now, we can do this. So then I need to connect to my SQL box. And the machine name is actually this. SQL SRV 2012 RC0, and I'll paste that into the chat window as well. Okay. I'm going to click connect. We can connect to our server, and you can see, in fact, yes, our SQL Server agent is not running. So I'm going to just give it a second, and then right-click on it and click Start, and that's going to go out to the SQL Server and start the agent on it. Okay. So once we have our agent running, we can pop back here, F5, refresh the page, and you can see now it detects that it is running. Okay, so then we can do one of two things. We can enter in the name of a user that has access to SQL here, and then SharePoint will go ahead and grant the proper privileges to the agent. Or we could download a script, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to just open it instead of saving it off to the file system, again, because I have Management Studio on here. And I can either take that script and hand it to a DBA for them to run, or I can go ahead and run it myself if I have privileges, which I do. So I'm going to click Execute. Okay, great. So we now have the privileges to go ahead and execute our own reporting, or sorry, to offer user-driven subscriptions in our environment. So that's all of the central administration configuration we need to do for reporting services. Now I want to go back in and do the same thing and make sure PowerPivot is working for us. And it's a bit of a trickier beast. So again, to do that, I'm going to go to Application Management, Manage Service Applications. And now I want to go into my PowerPivot service application. So I'm going to click on it. And one of the first things it's going to do is load up some PowerPivot workbooks. Now, you can see we've got an error right off the bat. It says this workbook cannot be opened because it is not stored in an Excel Services application trusted location, which might be odd because you've got Excel Services in your environment already. It's been working. Users can render the reports. Well, if I click OK, you're going to see what happens. We pop into this library, and the actual workbook it's trying to open is this one down at the bottom. It says Workbook Activity. And if I click on it, you'll see we get the exact same error. Okay? So where is this located? Well, if you look up at our address bar, or just up at our breadcrumbs, you can see it's in a folder called 1033 in a library called PowerPivot Management, stored in Central Administration. Well, now if we go over, and I'm just going to grab the URL of the site, or the root of the site. We're going to need it here in a second. If we go back again to Application Management Service Applications, and instead of going into PowerPivot, we look at Excel Services, one of the options we have here is for trusted file locations. So if I click on that, you can see, in fact, we do have the trusted file location set up for our main portal, but we don't have one for Central Administration, which means any content that's stored in Central Administration we don't trust yet. So we have to tell Excel Services that we do, in fact, trust that. So I'm going to go ahead and add a trusted file location. The address I'm going to give it is that, and it's important to have the port number. That forms part of the address. It's a SharePoint Foundation location, and I want to trust all of the children of that address. So anything within Central Admin, I now trust. I'm going to scroll down here and just point out a couple of other things. One of the things you might want to change here is the maximum workbook size. By default, it's 10 megabytes. That's a little small, especially if you're working with PowerPivot data. And by the way, that is the setting in Excel Services in Office 365 today, and you can't change it at the moment. So I'm just going to throw a 0 behind it and make it 100 megabytes for the time being. I'm going to trust all of the data connections in there. And one of the changes I want to make here is this warn on refresh. I'm going to turn this feature off. And the reason I want to turn this off is because when Excel Services connects to a back-end data source, it wants to let you know that it's doing that. So if we turn this option on, anytime a user opens a spreadsheet, it's going to say, hey, this wants to go and get data from a back-end system. Are you okay with that? Well, if I'm using PowerPivot, every single time I open that spreadsheet, I will be connecting to a back-end data source, because when I upload a PowerPivot-enabled workbook, what SharePoint is actually doing is taking the data model out of the workbook and putting it in that analysis services that we just installed as PowerPivot for SharePoint. So in reality, Excel Services will always be connecting to that, what it considers to be foreign data source, and prompting users. So I want to make sure I turn that off. And while I'm at it, I'm going to come into my portal and do the same thing. So scroll down here and turn on the, I will scroll past it, or turn off the warn on refresh error. Okay, so now we should be able to go back into PowerPivot, right? And not so fast. We get another error. What's this all about? An error has occurred. Please try again. This is one of those friendly SharePoint errors that I'm sure we're all used to. How do you troubleshoot these errors? Well, typically when you see an error like this, I use a tool. Let's see if I've got it on here. I'm pretty sure I set it up. A tool, yeah, called the ULS Viewer. And this ULS Viewer is available from MSDN. Just go on any search engine, type in MSDN and ULS, and you'll find this thing. And when it's just an executable. I drop it on the desktop, and you can run it by saying File, Open from ULS, and the ULS is our SharePoint logs. I should spell that out. But it basically use a ULS feed. When I do that, I'm going to get a real live feed from SharePoint as errors come in. You can see everything's coming in here. Well, I'm going to turn down the verbosity of this, so I'm only seeing high priority errors. And I'm going to pop back over here and try to load that workbook again. Please try again. Well, what's happened in our ULS viewer? Well, what we should see here is failed to read from stream. And if we look at it, if we look at that error in detail, I have a hard time scrolling. I hope you can see that in the window anyway. You can see that we've gotten a SQL exception. The execute permission was denied on the object proc, et cetera, from the SP admin content database. Well, what's that all about? Well, I obviously knew this error was going to happen. This happens because there's a bug in the PowerPivot rollout, and in the administration database, for this to work, we have our security tab. Now I've popped back into SQL Server Management Studio, coming down here to users. So SP Services is the service account that we're using, that PowerPivot is configured to use, and it needs to have appropriate access. Well, what does that access look like? It's in here. But if you look at its membership, you can see it's been granted the WSS Content Application Pools role. Well, it also needs to have the SharePoint Shell access role for this to work. And that's really it. Once we add that, we should be able to come in here and open that spreadsheet successfully. Just takes a second to load. All right, there's not going to be any data in here. This just tells us that it's working. We don't have any errors. It's just it happens to be empty. And again, if we come back to central administration, obviously, we should be able to go into application management, managed service applications, PowerPivot service application. And this time the page will load without errors. So what that means is PowerPivot has been configured properly. What's going to happen over time, and there's some health rules that'll do this, there's a number of PowerPivot timer jobs that go off, and it will collect up data about your usage of PowerPivot, and it will populate these spreadsheets. We may get to a little bit of that later, but that's essentially what's going on. So we're kind of done with central administration at this point. We're ready to go in and actually light up our site collection some. So I will quickly pause for if there's any passwords that have piled up. I don't see any, but that doesn't mean there isn't any.
Hey, John, while you're waiting for that, I do have a question.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, I do have a question from Joseph.
Yeah, fire away.
How long should PowerPivot config tool take to complete?
The config tool itself takes about 5 minutes to run, typically. But again, with this environment, you don't need to do it, unless you want to remove it. You shouldn't need to do it anyway.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so now we're in the root of our site collection. This is just a plain vanilla site collection. So I'm going to show you first of all what you need to do to light up reporting services. So one of the things you might want to do right off the bat is go into site setting and make sure that the features we need are turned on. They both should have been turned on automatically by the installation procedures, but sometimes things get messed up. So you just go into site collection features, and the ones you're going to look for are reporting servers integration feature, and it's in fact here, and the PowerPivot feature for site collections is in fact here. So those have both been turned on. Great. So at this point, what I want to do is light up reporting services, and I'm going to create a special library to house reporting services reports. Now, where you want to put your reports is a whole other topic that we could get into at some point in time, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you how. So to start with, I'm going to go and create a new, just straight up document library. Pretty dull, boring, and ordinary. And I'm going to call this library reporting. And it's going to load in. And just more on the how long it should take question from before. If everybody's using the environment, it might be a little bit slower than normal, just to throw that out there. As you can see, the library creation is taking a little longer than normal. A fair bit longer than normal. Sorry about this. All right, so we have a brand new, regular, plain Jane vanilla document library in SharePoint. Great. So first thing we want to do here is go into library settings. Now, reporting services features are mostly exposed through content types. So the first thing we have to do is allow content types in this library. So to do that, I'm going to go into Advanced Settings and allow the management of content types. Great. And okay, so you can see our UI down here has changed into the content type style UI. And now I'm going to add content types from the existing site content types. I'm just going to filter it down by group. I'm going to pick SQL Server Reporting Services content types. Outstanding. So there are 3 possible types to choose from. I'm going to pick 2, report and report data source. The reason I don't pick model is because model is rarely, A, it's rarely used, and B, it's somewhat deprecated. It was a concept that was introduced in Reporting Services 2005. It was the only way to build reports with Report Builder that came with 2005. And it's an abstraction of the data layer. So you build out a model and allow end users to work off that. It's a good idea, but it's pretty much what we're moving towards with the new BISM models that are coming out in the future. Actually, we can't use them today with straight up reporting services unless we're using PowerView. But we're just going to work with the source data, and so we need the data source and the data report. Now, in a production environment, I wouldn't put the 2 in the same library. I'd separate them with different different security models on the 2 different libraries. But for our purposes, again, here, I'm just going to throw them in the same library and click OK. And then finally, I'm going to get rid of the document content type because I don't want anybody adding Word files for Excel files in here. And so we've got a library that has just these 2 content types. Now, I would call it a good idea, if you're going to use this a lot, to go ahead and create a template based on this so that you don't have to go through all these steps every time you want to spin up a reporting services library. Okay, but now that we have that, we can come in here, and if you go up here to Documents, I can pick the drop-down on New Document, and I have 2 choices. I can use a Report Data Source or Report Builder Report. Well, I'll quickly first day with the new mouth. Quickly create a report data source. I'm just going to give it a name, market data. It's going to be our data source is going to be Microsoft SQL Server. I'm going to need to know my connection string. It doesn't have a string builder for me, and I'm just going to copy it from over here so you don't have to watch me fumbling around. So I'm just going to paste this in here. So the data source is that same SQL Server that's in your chat window, and the initial catalog is market data is the name of the database. Under credentials, we have a few options. We can use Windows authentication, which is going to use basically Kerberos if we've got it installed. Now in this environment, we're not using Kerberos. What that means is we're left with what's called the double hop problem. When our SQL Server is not on the same machine that SharePoint is on, which is also not the same machine as I'm coming in from. So I'm coming in on a browser as a user on SharePoint. SharePoint can't pass my token off to SQL Server. It can't really impersonate me through the operating system unless you're using Kerberos. So that's what this option is going to be. I almost never use it unless I'm in an environment that uses Kerberos. So what are our options? Well, we could ask the user what the credentials are every time. Not fun. Or we can use stored credentials. So if we're using stored credentials, we can use effectively a proxy account. In this case, I'm going to use AD2008R2 /SP_farm. You should never, ever do this, obviously, in production. The password is uppercase P @SSWord and the number 1. And I'm going to say use as Windows credentials. I'll click Test Connections to see if that works, and it's able to connect to the back-end SQL Server. Now, there's this other option here, set execution context to this account. To my mind, this is one of the most understood features or misunderstood features of reporting services. If you look at the back-end schema for the connection document, it doesn't mean the same thing. If you actually build a connection using Report Builder itself, it's got different language here. In Report Builder, what this option says is impersonate the currently authenticated user when connecting, and that's really what it does. If I set this option, it will make the connection to SQL using the account I just punched in, but every query will be run as if it's the currently logged in user. So it's a way to get around it, to kind of provide per user authentication without actually using Kerberos. I don't need it for our purposes right now. I'm going to leave it off and enable the data source, and I'm going to click OK. All right. And how do I create a new report? Well, I could use Visual Studio and deploy, and that's a good option in a lot of cases. But if I'm a power user, I might want to just come up here to Documents, click on New Document, and pick Report Builder Report. And what that's going to do is it's going to send an application down to my workstation. It's a one-click installation of a product called Report Builder, and I'm just going to run it. And we're just going to quickly create the most rudimentary report you've ever seen in your life. I'm just watching my time very carefully here. We've got 10 minutes left, so I don't want to waste too much time on our report. We got to get to PowerPivot here as well. Come on, Report Builder. Here it comes. All right. So we're just going to run through real quickly. We're going to use the table wizard. It's asking about the data set. We're going to create a new data set. With this new data set, we're going to use the data source we've already created. So I'm just going to browse to it. It should be in Reporting. So there's the one we just created. I click OK. Test the connection. Make sure it works. Yes, it does. Click Next. And it's going to make sure I have access to the connection document in SharePoint, which I obviously do. So I'm going to click P@SS1. Click OK, and that's basically Report Builder connecting back to SharePoint, what you just saw there. So what do we want to report on? Well, I'm going to use the report view for ticker value. I'm going to bring all that data over. And for the row groups, I don't know, we'll go with ticker date. We'll go ticker price with the values, and we'll go ticker name. This is a database of stock index values since like 1928. I'll click Next and Next. And finish. I just picked some options. So there's a very rudimentary report. If I hit save, I'm not going to even preview it right now because I don't want to take the time. Market data. So I'm just going to hope it works here. Save it into reporting. And close Report Builder. I'll hit F5, and you can see we've got a new report here. If we just click on it, it should render. And while it's doing that, I should also mention we could use the Reporting Services web part and embed this report in another page, and we can even pass parameters into it through filter web parts, etc. I'm going to pop over to PowerPivot here in just a second, but I just really quickly wanted to ask if there's any questions around Reporting Services.
Not so far, John.
Excellent. Okay. I'm sure everybody's got it then. Here we go. And this is just a bunch of numbers to you, obviously, because we didn't do any work on it. But it's rendered this report out here in the browser in SharePoint. So Reporting Services is working like a charm for us. So let's light up Performance Point. That's a whole different PowerPivot for SharePoint. So we've installed PowerPivot. We know that the features been enabled. What we want to do is create a new library for PowerPivot. And unlike Reporting Services, there's a template ready-made for us. So if I look under library, you can see we've got this special PowerPivot Gallery. So I'm going to call it PowerPivots. Click OK. One of the first things, this looks a little different than most. You don't normally see that kind of a UI with SharePoint. That's because this front page is based on Silverlight, so you will need Silverlight on your workstations to use the PowerPivot Gallery. So how do we build a PowerPivot? Well, we start with Excel, actually. So I'm going to go into All Programs, Office, and I'm going to go against the same data. So I'm going to fire up Microsoft Excel. And hopefully I can get to this nice little trick. So I'm going to click on the PowerPivot tab and create a new PowerPivot window. So PowerPivot, if you don't already know, it's an add-in to Excel with 2010. You can download it. It's free. And it basically is an in-memory analysis services for Excel. So you can work with massive amounts of data right within Excel and do all kinds of mashups with it. So anyway, I'm going to pull some data from the database. I'm going to pull from SQL Server. I'm going to hope I left the name in there, and I didn't, but I can trim it out. So I'm going to pick that server name, that same one we've been using all the way along. Pick the database, which is market data. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to select from a list of tables. I'm going to click Next. And I'm going to pick this view again, that ticker value. That's the same one we use for reporting services. And I'm just going to call it indexes. And I'm going to hit Finish. All right, close. And that's nice as it stands. I could do some interesting things with it. I'm not going to get too fancy with this because it's mostly architectural. One thing I do want to show, though, is we can add more data in there. So let's say I've got this date field, but I want to break it down by year, month, day, all of that stuff. I want to add some time intelligence, but I don't want to build the formulas in here. Well, if you've ever been out to the Azure Data Market, we can there's a feed that's available for you. And I'm just going to try and find my URL. There it is. So what you need to do is have an account. You sign up with that account. I'm going to punch in the feed and this account key. So this part you won't be able to follow along with until you get one. And then I hit Next. And you can see there are a number of calendars you can choose from. I'm just going to pick Basic Calendar US and rename it. Calendar. Click Finish. And I don't know if you've seen PowerPivot demonstrations before, but I've seen demonstrations when they're loading up to a couple 100 million rows of data right into Excel. It's extremely powerful. So we should have a little over 70,000 rows, and basically there's a row for every day from 1900 till 2100, something like that. So I'm going to hit Close. Now you can see we have two tables in here. I'm going to really quickly go in here into Diagram View. I'm going to establish a relationship between these two tables. Which is ticker date is going to go against date key. Now I can go and rename all of these columns, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to take a little more time than we have, so I'm not going to bother doing that. But when we're ready, I'm going to go ahead, pick the pivot table option, and I'm going to create a pivot table in Excel. So I'm just going to go pivot table into an existing worksheet. And what I want to do is put in indexes, I want to put the ticker price. I'll be in my sum values, and I don't want it to be a sum. I want it to be a average because these are index values. They don't need to be added up. The ticker name is going to go in my column labels, and then the year from the timetable will be over here. So you can see what the average index values were for each year for all of these stocks. I could break it out more, and I could also use, if I wanted to, the price type name as a slicer. So I'm going to add a slicer, and I could pick between the average for the highs, the opens, the closes, and the lows. Okay, so I'm ready. I've got some interactivity here, which is what I was trying to show. I'm going to save this off. Almost out of time. Market data. Save. Now, if I look in here and under documents, you can see market data. You saw how much data we brought in. It's a total of 5 megabytes. Not really a whole lot. So it's highly compressed is the point I'm trying to make. So I'm going to go in here in my PowerPivots library, and now I'm going to click on Documents, upload the document, browse, pick Browse. There we go. Market data. Okay. Okay. And what we'll see is our document has been loaded, and it's actually going to build a little thumbnail so we can see what's going on ahead of time. But without waiting for the thumbnail, I'll click on market data. And you can see there's the results of our model. But the important part is I should be able to click on open, and you see it takes a minute. It's working, right? We've got the hourglass, and then bang. So that slicer is working against that model in the browser, in Excel services. And you'll notice how much faster it is now when we click on it. And that's because the initial click, what literally happened is that Excel services took the model out of Excel, spun up an analysis services, call it a cube, put it in that PowerPivot, and then we're working against that until the data gets refreshed. I don't have time to get into it, but from this main gallery, we can also come in here. You can see these are our little thumbnails have been built. We could come in here and create a Power View report. So please feel free to go play with that. That's the new visualization reporting tool. Or if we wanted to keep this data fresh, we could click here on the scheduler, and we could basically say, I want you, server, to go out to my data sources and refresh this on a periodic basis. But with that, I think I'm completely out of time. Real quickly, some of the changes in 2013. If you're coming to the SharePoint conference, I'm giving a talk on that. The PowerPivot model is now baked into Excel. It's not a separate add-in. There are better scalability options on the back end to support that on the server side. And you do need PowerPivot for SharePoint still, no matter what, to do the auto data refresh. And here are a few resources for you. So the configuration guide for PowerPivot is the first item. The ULS log viewer that I mentioned earlier, there's a link for that. I have a couple of blog posts on this stuff. I didn't get to the health analyzer, but one of the things you'll want to do is walk through that and make sure your PowerPivot environment is healthy. This tells you what of those alerts are real and what aren't, and then scaling options here. But that's about it for me. So sorry I went a little bit over, I think, but. If there's any more questions, I can take them if we have time.
No, no more questions. Okay. John, thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
It was great, and I think we managed to pull some more content this time, which is awesome.
We did. We did.
Good job. So thank you very much for your time, and everybody for being with us today. I want to re-emphasize that the slides and the recording will be available in a few days. If you want to take the environments and play with them, get your hands dirty, that you can do that. Again, you can just click on the link. You can see it in the recording that you'll get from us, and get the experience with CloudShare and follow John's actions from today. One more note, if you're interested in SharePoint 2013, we do have a few permalinks and SharePoint environments fully configured that you can get access to in less than 60 seconds. It's quite amazing. One of them actually John did for us. So thank you again, John.
Yep. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Can we get those?
And you can get those. Thank you, Gabe. Gallery by going to our website and clicking on the showcase link at the top. And with that, I want to conclude today's session. Thank you very much, and looking forward to have you on our next webinars.